A Japanese soldier refused to believe World War II was over. For 29 years, he kept fighting in the jungles of the Philippines. He killed dozens of people, burned crops, staged guerrilla attacks, and when they finally found him in 1974, he wouldn't surrender until his old commander flew across the world to personally order him to stop. This is the story of Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who fought a war that had already ended. A man so devoted to his mission that he turned down rescue attempts, ignored surrender orders, and continued his duty long after everyone else had gone home. But here's what makes this story even crazier. Onoda wasn't alone out there. He had companions, and one by one they either left or died, leaving him completely isolated in the jungle. By the end, he was the last man standing in a war that existed only in his mind. And the most shocking part, when he finally came out of the jungle, he became a hero in Japan. Not a war criminal, not a murderer, a hero. So how does a soldier fight a war for 3 decades after it's over? What kind of training would make someone so committed to a mission that they'd sacrifice their entire life? And what happens to a person's mind when they spend 29 years believing everyone around them is lying? Let me take you back to 1944. World War II is still raging. Japan is losing badly, but they're not giving up. The Pacific Theater is a nightmare of island hopping, brutal combat, and desperate last stands. And the Japanese military has a problem. They need soldiers who can operate behind enemy lines, soldiers who won't quit, soldiers who won't surrender no matter what. Enter the Nakano School. This wasn't your regular military training facility. This was where Japan trained its intelligence officers and guerrilla warfare specialists. The philosophy was simple but extreme. Never surrender. Never give up your mission. Death before dishonor. And if you're captured, take your own life rather than become a prisoner. Hiroo Onoda was one of these specially trained soldiers. He was 22 years old when he arrived at the Nakano School in 1944. Young, intelligent, and about to receive training that would literally shape the next 30 years of his life. The training at Nakano was intense. They taught guerrilla warfare, intelligence gathering, survival skills, and propaganda techniques. But more than the physical skills, they drilled in a mindset, an unbreakable mindset. Your mission comes before everything. Before your comfort, before your safety, before your life. The Emperor's orders are absolute, and surrender is not an option under any circumstances. Onoda graduated from Nakano School and received his assignment in December 1944. He was being sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines with a specific mission: conduct guerrilla warfare against Allied forces, gather intelligence, and under no circumstances allow the enemy to capture the island's resources. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him direct orders that would haunt him for the next 3 decades. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. You may have to live on coconuts. If that's the case, live on coconuts. Under no circumstances are you to give up your life voluntarily. These orders, these exact words, they became Onoda's entire world. He arrived on Lubang Island in early 1945 with a small group of soldiers. The island is about 30 miles southwest of Manila. Small, tropical, covered in dense jungle, the perfect place for guerrilla operations. Onoda immediately got to work setting up camps, planning ambushes, and preparing for a long campaign. But here's the thing, World War II was already falling apart for Japan. Just a few months after Onoda arrived on Lubang, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. The war was over, except Onoda didn't know that, or more accurately, he didn't believe it. In October 1945, just 2 months after Japan's official surrender, the first leaflets started falling from the sky over Lubang Island, printed messages declaring that the war was over, instructions for Japanese soldiers to surrender, promises of safe passage and fair treatment. Onoda and his men found these leaflets. They read them carefully, and then they made a decision. This was enemy propaganda, an obvious trick to lure them out of hiding. They'd been trained at Nakano School to expect exactly this kind of psychological warfare. The Americans were trying to deceive them. The war was still on. This wasn't paranoia. This was their training. They'd literally been taught that the enemy would try every trick to make them surrender. Fake surrender orders, false news about the war ending, propaganda designed to break their will. The fact that leaflets were falling from the sky actually confirmed to Onoda that he was doing the right thing by staying hidden. At this point, Onoda wasn't alone. He had 3 other soldiers with him: Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. 4 men, young, trained, committed, living in the jungle, surviving on stolen food, coconuts and bananas, conducting guerrilla operations against what they believed were enemy occupiers. But the Philippines was no longer at war. The people living on Lubang Island weren't enemy combatants. They were farmers, fishermen, families, regular people trying to rebuild their lives after a devastating war. And suddenly, these 4 Japanese soldiers were raiding their farms, burning their crops, and occasionally shooting at them. The local authorities tried everything to get these soldiers to come out. More leaflets, loudspeaker announcements, messages from the Japanese government. Nothing worked. The 4 soldiers had created a reality in their minds where all of this was elaborate enemy deception. In 1949, 4 years after the war ended, one of the soldiers broke. Private Akatsu couldn't take it anymore. The isolation, the constant fear, the endless hiding. He made the decision to leave the group and surrender. The other 3 soldiers watched him go, and in their minds, Akatsu had committed the ultimate betrayal. He'd abandoned his post, given up his mission. They would not make the same mistake. Now there were 3. The years kept passing. 1950, 1951, 1952. The 3 remaining soldiers developed an incredibly sophisticated survival system. They had multiple camps hidden throughout the jungle. They rotated between locations to avoid detection. They kept detailed schedules for raids. They maintained their weapons meticulously, and they continued their mission of guerrilla warfare against an enemy that, in reality, didn't exist. The local police and military tried to find them. Search parties went into the jungle. But Lubang Island is covered in thick jungle terrain, and these were highly trained guerrilla fighters who'd spent years learning every inch of the island. They were ghosts, occasionally seen, never caught. In 1952, the Japanese government got involved. They flew family members to Lubang Island. Onoda's own brothers came. They used loudspeakers to broadcast personal messages. "Hiroo, the war is over. Mother is waiting for you. Please come home." Onoda heard these messages. He heard his brother's voice, and he concluded it was a recording. Another trick. The enemy had captured his brother and forced him to make propaganda. Or they'd found a voice actor who sounded similar. Anything was more believable than the idea that the emperor had surrendered. Think about how powerful his training must have been. He heard his own brother's voice calling him home, and his brain immediately found a way to explain it that fit his existing worldview. This is what intense military indoctrination can do. It creates a framework so strong that contradictory evidence gets reinterpreted to fit the narrative. 1954. 9 years after the war ended, tragedy struck Onoda's small group. Corporal Shimada was shot and killed by a search party. The circumstances are disputed. Some say he fired first, others say it was a misunderstanding, but the result was the same. Shimada was dead. Now there were two, just Onoda and Kazuka. You'd think this would be the breaking point. One of their group had been killed. Surely this would make them question whether they were still at war, but it had the opposite effect. To Onoda and Kazuka, Shimada's death proved they were right. They were still at war. The enemy had just killed one of their soldiers. This confirmed everything. The mission continued. For the next 18 years, it was just the two of them. Onoda and Kazuka, two men living in the jungle, aging, their uniforms falling apart and being repaired over and over, their weapons carefully maintained despite the tropical humidity, their resolve never wavering. They established an even more sophisticated routine. They had a calendar system to track dates. They kept a journal documenting their activities. They continued to raid farms for food, though they tried to only take what they needed. They saw themselves as professional soldiers, not bandits. They were requisitioning supplies for the war effort. The local people on Lubang Island lived in constant fear of these two Japanese soldiers. Occasionally someone would spot them in the jungle. Sometimes crops would be stolen or burned. Every few years there would be a shooting. The government kept trying to coax them out, but nothing worked. In 1959, Japan officially declared Onoda and Kazuka dead. From a legal standpoint, they were casualties of the war. Memorial services were held, their families mourned. But in reality, they were still out there, still fighting, still waiting for their commander to return. The 1960s passed, then the early 1970s. Onoda was now in his 50s. Kazuka was slightly younger. They'd spent the majority of their adult lives in the jungle. They'd never experienced peace, never had normal jobs, never started families. Their entire existence was this mission. Then, in 1972, another tragedy. Kazuka was shot and killed during a raid on a rice farm. Police had been stationed there waiting for them. Kazuka died. Onoda escaped. Now he was truly alone. The last soldier. The only one left. Most people would have given up at this point. Your last companion is dead. You're 50 years old. You've been in the jungle for 27 years. The rational decision would be to surrender. But Onoda didn't make the rational decision. He made the decision his training had programmed into him: continue the mission. One soldier is still one soldier. Keep fighting. This is where the story gets really interesting. In February 1974, a young Japanese man named Norio Suzuki was traveling the world. He was 24 years old, adventurous, and had a bucket list of strange things he wanted to find. He told friends he was searching for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. He was joking about Onoda being a mythical creature like Bigfoot, but he genuinely wanted to find him. So Suzuki traveled to Lubang Island and started camping in the jungle. He wasn't part of an official search party. He didn't have government backing. He was just a tourist with a crazy idea. And somehow, miraculously, he found Onoda. Imagine this scene. Suzuki is in the jungle, and suddenly he sees this man. Thin, weathered, wearing a tattered uniform, holding a rifle. This is a person who spent nearly 30 years in the jungle. His uniform is held together with patches. His weapon is immaculately maintained. His eyes are sharp and suspicious. They started talking. And here's what's amazing. Onoda didn't attack him, didn't run away. Something about Suzuki's approach must have felt genuine. Maybe it was because Suzuki wasn't trying to convince him the war was over. He wasn't trying to trick him. He was just talking to him like a human being. Onoda told Suzuki his story, explained his mission, said he was still waiting for orders from his commanding officer. And Suzuki had an idea. What if we find your actual commanding officer and bring him here? Would you surrender then? Onoda agreed, but only if his direct superior officer, Major Taniguchi, personally gave him orders to stand down. No one else would do. Not the government, not the emperor. Only the man who gave him the original orders could take them back. This presented a problem. Major Taniguchi was no longer in the military. He'd retired after the war ended. He was now a bookseller, living a quiet civilian life. He'd long ago moved on from his military career, but Suzuki tracked him down and convinced him to return to Lubang Island. March 9, 1974. Major Taniguchi arrived on Lubang Island. He was now an older man, civilian clothes, looking nothing like the commanding officer who'd sent Onoda on this mission 29 years earlier. But Onoda recognized him immediately. They met in a predetermined location in the jungle. Onoda appeared in his tattered uniform. He saluted, still maintaining military protocol after all these years, still treating this like an active military operation. Major Taniguchi did something he probably never imagined he'd have to do. He read out new orders, official orders relieving Onoda of his duty. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The emperor had commanded peace. Onoda's mission was complete. He was ordered to stand down and return home. And just like that, after 29 years, Onoda accepted it, because the right person said it, because it followed the proper chain of command, because it fit within the framework of military orders that had governed his entire life since Nakano School. Onoda formally surrendered. He handed over his rifle, his sword, his hand grenades, and even his military orders, still preserved and carried with him all these years. He walked out of the jungle, and the world went crazy. Think about this for a second. This man had just spent 3 decades in the jungle. He'd killed approximately 30 people during his guerrilla campaign. He'd burned crops, stolen food, and terrorized local communities. By any reasonable standard, these were criminal acts. The war had been over for 29 years. These were attacks on innocent civilians. But when Onoda emerged from the jungle, he became an instant celebrity, not just in Japan, but worldwide. News cameras were everywhere. Reporters wanted interviews. People wanted to hear his story. And the Philippine government, which could have prosecuted him for the killings, instead granted him a full pardon. President Ferdinand Marcos personally pardoned all of Onoda's wartime actions. Why? Because the story was so compelling. Because Onoda was seen as a man of incredible dedication and loyalty. Because there was something almost admirable about his stubborn commitment to his mission, even if that mission was completely unnecessary. When Onoda returned to Japan, he was treated like a hero. Think about how strange this is. He'd been fighting a war that didn't exist. He'd killed people who were just trying to live their lives, but Japanese society saw him as the embodiment of loyalty, duty, and the old samurai spirit of never giving up. But here's what nobody expected. Onoda hated modern Japan. The Japan that Onoda returned to in 1974 was completely different from the Japan he'd left in 1944. He'd left Imperial Japan, a militaristic society where duty and honor meant everything. He returned to a modern, peaceful, capitalist democracy where young people had long hair and questioned authority. He found it disgusting. The consumer culture, the materialism, the lack of discipline, the casual attitude toward duty and responsibility. Everything he'd fought for, everything he'd sacrificed 29 years of his life for, seemed to be gone. Modern Japan had abandoned the values he held sacred. He tried to adapt. He wrote a book about his experiences called No Surrender, My 30-Year War. It became a bestseller. He gave speeches and interviews. For a while, he was one of the most famous people in Japan. But he couldn't fit in. The world had moved on without him. He'd aged 29 years in the jungle, while society had transformed around him. He was a relic, a living piece of history that didn't match the present. In 1975, just a year after returning, Onoda moved to Brazil. He bought a ranch and became a cattle farmer. He wanted to get away from modern Japan, away from the cameras, away from the society he no longer understood. He wanted a simple life with clear rules and honest work. But the story doesn't end there. In the 1980s, Onoda started to worry about Japanese youth. He saw them as soft, lacking discipline, unable to survive hardship. So he started a nature school called the Onoda Nature School, where he taught survival skills, camping and wilderness training to young people. He'd gone from guerrilla fighter to farmer to teacher, always trying to pass on the skills and mindset that had defined his life. The training from Nakano School never really left him. That core of discipline and self-reliance stayed with him until his death. Onoda died in 2014 at the age of 91. He'd spent 29 years fighting a war that was over, then 40 years living in a world that had moved beyond war. His entire life was bookended by conflict and its aftermath. So what do we learn from Hiroo Onoda's story? On the surface, it's about a soldier who took orders too seriously, a man who couldn't adapt when circumstances changed. But it's actually much deeper than that. First, it shows the incredible power of indoctrination. The training Onoda received at Nakano School was so effective that it overrode every natural instinct for self-preservation, comfort, and social connection. He heard his brother's voice telling him to come home, and his training made him reject that as propaganda. That's not just dedication, that's psychological programming that fundamentally altered how he processed information. The Nakano School didn't just teach skills, it created a worldview, a framework for interpreting reality. And once that framework was in place, everything else got filtered through it. Evidence that the war was over became evidence of enemy deception. The death of his companions became proof he needed to keep fighting. His own suffering became validation of his sacrifice. This is a warning about the danger of absolute belief systems. When you're convinced that you have the complete truth and that anyone contradicting you is either lying or deceived, you become unable to update your understanding when reality changes. Onoda wasn't stupid, he wasn't crazy. He was operating perfectly logically within a framework that was fundamentally disconnected from reality. Second, this story reveals something about honor culture versus practical reality. Japanese society in 1944 was built on concepts of honor, duty, and loyalty that overrode personal welfare. The emperor was sacred, orders were absolute, surrender was shameful. These weren't just abstract ideas, they were the foundation of how people understood themselves and their place in the world. Onoda internalized these values completely, and when he returned to find that modern Japan had abandoned them, he felt betrayed. The society he'd sacrificed everything for had changed into something he didn't recognize or respect. This is the tragedy of soldiers who fight for ideals rather than practical goals. The ideals can disappear while you're still fighting for them. Third, and maybe most important, this story shows what happens when someone's sense of purpose becomes their prison. Onoda's mission gave his life meaning. It gave him structure, identity, and a clear sense of right and wrong. But it also trapped him. He couldn't leave because his entire identity was built around being the soldier who never gives up. His greatest strength became his greatest weakness. There's something almost beautiful about his dedication, something we want to admire, the man who never quits, the soldier who keeps his word no matter what. But there's also something horrifying about it, because that dedication came at an enormous cost, not just to him, but to the people he killed, the families he terrorized, and the life he never got to live. The people on Lubang Island didn't see a hero. They saw a dangerous man who killed their neighbors and burned their crops for 3 decades. When Onoda finally surrendered, some of them were relieved. Others were angry. The families of the people he'd killed wanted justice, not pardons. But the narrative of the loyal soldier was so powerful that it overrode their suffering in the public consciousness. Here's something that makes this even more interesting. Onoda wasn't the only Japanese soldier who refused to believe the war was over. There were others, lots of others. The most famous was Shoichi Yokoi, who was found on Guam in 1972, 2 years before Onoda. Yokoi had been hiding for 28 years, but unlike Onoda, Yokoi knew the war was over. He'd found leaflets and newspapers. He understood that Japan had surrendered, but he was too ashamed to come out. He thought he'd be punished for surviving when so many of his comrades had died. So he stayed hidden, living in a cave, surviving on rats and coconuts, too ashamed to return home. When Yokoi was finally discovered, his first words were, "It is with much embarrassment that I return." Not pride, not relief, embarrassment. Because in his mind, a proper soldier should have died rather than hide for 28 years. There were other soldiers found in the 1970s and even into the 1980s. Each one had their own story. Some believed the war was still happening. Some knew it was over, but were too afraid or ashamed to return. Some had simply gone feral, losing connection with civilization entirely. The Japanese military had done such an effective job training these men to never surrender that they'd created soldiers who couldn't stop being soldiers even when the war ended. It's one of history's strangest unintended consequences. Let's talk about what was actually happening in Onoda's brain during those 29 years. Psychologists have studied his case extensively because it's such an extreme example of belief persistence and cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you hold 2 contradicting beliefs at the same time, and your brain has to resolve the conflict. For most people, when reality contradicts their beliefs, they eventually adjust their beliefs to match reality. But Onoda did the opposite. He adjusted his perception of reality to match his beliefs. Every piece of evidence that the war was over got reinterpreted. Leaflets, propaganda, radio broadcasts, fake. His brother's voice, a recording or impersonator, the modern clothes people were wearing, stolen from Americans. The new buildings, constructed by occupying forces. His brain created increasingly elaborate explanations to maintain his core belief that the war was still happening. This is called motivated reasoning. When we really want to believe something, our brain becomes incredibly creative at finding evidence to support that belief and dismissing evidence against it. Onoda wasn't stupid, he was just profoundly motivated to maintain his identity as a soldier on a mission. There's also the sunk cost fallacy at play. The longer Onoda stayed in the jungle, the harder it became to admit he might be wrong. If he'd surrendered after 5 years, he would have wasted 5 years. But after 29 years, admitting he was wrong would mean accepting that he'd wasted nearly 3 decades of his life, that he'd killed people for nothing, that his suffering was pointless. The psychological cost of that admission was too high, so his brain kept finding reasons to believe he was right. And then there's the social isolation factor. Humans are social creatures. We develop our sense of reality partly through comparison with others. When you're alone in the jungle with only 1 or 2 other people who share your beliefs, there's no social reality check, no one to gently point out that maybe, just maybe, the war is actually over. The longer Onoda was isolated, the more his internal reality diverged from external reality. Some psychologists have compared Onoda's situation to cult members who remain devoted even after their leaders' predictions fail. The predictions fail, but instead of abandoning the belief system, followers create new explanations for why the prediction didn't come true and why they should remain devoted. The fundamental framework never gets questioned, because questioning it would destroy their entire identity. Let's address the elephant in the room. Hiroo Onoda killed approximately 30 people during his 29 years in the jungle. These weren't enemy soldiers. They were farmers, police officers, and local residents of Lubang Island, people who were just trying to live their lives in peacetime. So why did he get pardoned? Why did Japan treat him like a hero instead of prosecuting him for murder? The answer is complicated and reveals a lot about how societies handle their warriors after conflicts end. Onoda was given a special moral status because of his perceived motivations. He wasn't killing for pleasure or personal gain. In his mind, he was following orders and defending his country. His actions, while harmful, came from a place of duty rather than malice. This matters to how societies judge soldiers. We create different moral categories for violence committed under orders versus violence committed for personal reasons. A soldier who kills in combat is treated differently from a civilian who commits murder, even though the end result, someone is dead, is the same. But here's where it gets murky. At what point does following orders stop being an excuse? The Nuremberg trials after World War II established that soldiers can't just blindly follow orders. They have a responsibility to refuse illegal or immoral commands. If Onoda was following orders to commit guerrilla warfare, but the war was over and his targets were civilians, shouldn't he be held accountable? The Philippine government decided that Onoda's unique circumstances, his genuine belief that the war was ongoing, his training, his isolation, created a situation where punishment wasn't appropriate. They saw him more as a victim of his training than as a deliberate murderer. President Marcos's pardon was partly humanitarian and partly political. Prosecuting a 52-year-old man who'd been living in the jungle for 3 decades wouldn't serve justice or peace. Japan's treatment of Onoda as a hero is more problematic. It revealed a nostalgia for the old imperial values, loyalty, duty, sacrifice, that many Japanese people felt had been lost in the rapid modernization after the war. Onoda represented a connection to that past. He was the last samurai, the ultimate example of never giving up. His story let people celebrate those old values without having to confront the darker aspects of Imperial Japan that led to World War II in the first place. The families of the people Onoda killed didn't see a hero. They saw their suffering being erased by a compelling narrative. One victim's family said they felt forgotten when the world celebrated Onoda's loyalty while ignoring the fact that their loved one had been killed by a man fighting a war that didn't exist. This tension between honoring a soldier's dedication and acknowledging the harm caused by that dedication remains unresolved. Onoda himself seemed to struggle with it later in life. In interviews, he expressed regret for the people who died, but never quite apologized. He maintained that he'd been doing his duty, even though intellectually he understood the war had been over. What's Hiroo Onoda's legacy? What should we take from this bizarre, tragic, fascinating story? For military historians, Onoda represents the extreme end result of certain types of military training. The Nakano School's methods were incredibly effective at creating committed soldiers, but they also created people who couldn't turn off their soldier mindset when circumstances changed. Modern military training now includes more emphasis on critical thinking and adapting to changing situations precisely because of cases like Onoda's. For psychologists, Onoda is a case study in belief persistence, cognitive dissonance, and how powerful social conditioning can be. His story gets taught in psychology courses as an example of how our brains can create entire alternate realities to protect our core beliefs and identity. For the general public, Onoda has become a symbol, but he's a symbol that means different things to different people. For some, he represents admirable qualities like loyalty, discipline, and dedication. For others, he represents the dangers of blind obedience and inability to adapt. Both interpretations are partially correct, which is what makes his story so enduring. There's also a lesson here about the costs of war that extend far beyond the battlefield. Wars end on paper when treaties are signed, but they continue in the minds and bodies of the people who fought them. Onoda is an extreme example, but there are millions of veterans who struggle to transition from military to civilian life, who feel disconnected from societies that have moved on while they're still mentally in the war zone. The fact that Onoda moved to Brazil and couldn't integrate into modern Japan speaks to this. He wasn't just fighting a war in the jungle, he was fighting a war against the passage of time itself. He wanted to return to the Japan of 1944, but that Japan was gone forever. His 29 years in the Ye jungle had frozen him in time while the world transformed around him. Onoda lived another 40 years after his surrender. He split his time between Brazil and Japan, running his nature school and giving occasional interviews. He wrote a second book in 1995 called No Surrender 2 that reflected on his experiences with more distance and perspective. In his later years, Onoda softened somewhat. He became less critical of modern Japan and more focused on teaching survival skills and self-reliance to young people. His nature school wasn't about creating soldiers, it was about teaching kids to be comfortable in nature, to develop confidence through challenges, and to understand self-discipline. He returned to Lubang Island in 1996, 22 years after his surrender. He donated $10,000 to the local school and met with some of the families affected by his guerrilla campaign. It wasn't quite an apology tour, but it was his attempt to make some kind of peace with the place where he'd spent 3 decades. The people of Lubang had mixed reactions to his visit. Some appreciated his donation and saw it as a gesture of reconciliation. Others felt it was too little, too late. The wounds he'd caused ran deep, and no amount of money could bring back the people who died. Onoda died on January 16, 2014, in Tokyo. He was 91 years old. His death made international news. The last holdout soldier from World War II was finally gone. In a way, his death marked the absolute final end of World War II. The war that officially ended in 1945 didn't truly end until 2014, when the last soldier stopped fighting it. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including military officials, politicians, and former students from his nature school. He was remembered as a complex figure, simultaneously admirable and troubling, dedicated and stubborn, a hero and a cautionary tale. Hiroo Onoda spent 29 years fighting a war that was over. He killed people who weren't his enemies. He suffered through decades of isolation and hardship for a mission that had been completed without him. And when he finally came home, he found that everything he'd fought for had changed or disappeared. His story is about dedication taken to its extreme, about the power of training and belief to override reality itself, about the costs of war that echo long after the guns stop firing, about what happens when a person's identity becomes so fused with their mission that they can't separate themselves from it. Was he a hero? Was he a victim? Was he a murderer? Somehow he was all of these things, and none of them. He was a man shaped by forces beyond his control. The emperor, the military, the Nakano School, the war itself, who made choices within that framework that led to an extraordinary, tragic, fascinating life. The Japanese soldiers on Lubang Island believed they were serving something greater than themselves. They believed their suffering had meaning. They believed that one day their sacrifice would be recognized and rewarded, and in a way it was, just not in the way they expected. Onoda got to return home. He got to see his family again. He got to live a full life after his surrender. but he also had to live with the knowledge that he'd wasted his youth fighting for nothing, that the people he'd killed had died for nothing, that his incredible dedication and sacrifice had been, in the end, completely unnecessary. That's the real tragedy of Hiroo Onoda's story. Not that he fought for 29 years, but that those 29 years didn't need to happen. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The emperor had commanded peace, but Onoda kept fighting anyway, not because he was evil or crazy, but because his training had worked too well. He was the soldier who never gave up, and that's both the most admirable and most tragic thing about him. If this story got you thinking about the aftermath of war and soldiers who couldn't let go, subscribe if you want more history that challenges what you think you know.